Hey guys, thanks for hanging in there late on a school night. I appreciate you guys coming out. I appreciate you guys coming out to support, especially the hard work of the Neuroscience Club in general and Marissa in particular. Let's give her a round of applause for all she's done. She is incredible. She's such an inspiration, even to me. You know, Marissa came to me over a year ago, high school student wanting to do research in a neuroscience lab. And I just kept gaining so much respect for her because she's so focused and so driven that it kind of makes me think back, what was I doing when I was in high school? So Marissa's trajectory is, you know, very, very strong. But I personally am no different than any of you guys. I mean, I'm no different from our last speaker. I grew up in a single parent household with just my mom raising me, and a lot of adversity and good morals instilled in me from a Catholic school education and good people around me. I mean, I don't think, you know, that's the perspective of my talk, is that what makes us human, what makes our brains different from those of other mammals or other animals is our capacity to connect in a very unique way, in a cognitively elevated way compared to other species, right? There's this thing that's real called the human connection that other animals don't share. They can mimic it, and they can even do some amazing behaviors to care for their young, or to have solidarity, to fight as a group, to do things that humans actually are hesitant to do. But the human connection, the capacity for altruism, is unique to our species. And that's one of the things that I want to talk to you guys about today. There's several things actually. I mean, one part is science, another part is how that science translates into our everyday lives, and just a message that I hope will impact you guys going forward into the world. You're on the cusp of going out into this world and having an impact. And you know, what I do as part of my job is try to have impact in several different ways, whether that's in the lab, whether that's working with a student like Marissa, who I encourage to go on and do better than I've even done, or whether it's coming to talk to you guys or even young kids, 4th grade, 3rd grade, about mental illness, what it means, what it is not, and what we can do about it. I think that's the most important thing, is what I've learned from talking with people who have mental illness, or the parents especially of children who have a mental illness, is we all want some hope that it's not always going to be as bad to live with a mental illness as it is today. Okay, so these are the things I'm going to talk to you about. That didn't work. Okay, let's try the arrow. Okay, how did I get here? So I grew up in Utica, New York, right down the thruway, and I came out here to Syracuse in 1992 as an undergraduate biology major at SU. I wanted to be a marine biologist. I thought, you know, didn't all of us want to be a marine biologist at some point? Swim with the dolphins. And then I took a biology class, and biology really sucked really hard. I almost flunked out of college. That's not a joke. I almost flunked out of SU. SU was not #1 party school back then, but I almost flunked out because the classes were hard, and because I was goofing around, and because I had no purpose, I had no mission, I had no vision for my life or how I wanted to impact people in my life. I was just going through the motions. But biology was hard, and it changed my mind. I stuck with it. I graduated with a biology degree. I got a D in genetics, and here I am today, a genetic epidemiologist. Okay, so I'll tell you that story too. I got a lot of D's. But I also picked up psychology as a double major, because even though psychology is more abstract, you cannot do psychology in a dish, okay, like you can work with cells. But it felt more concrete to me. The concepts were just more accessible to me. So I picked up another major in psychology. And then I went to graduate school at Northeastern University, which is in Boston. Much better school now than when I got into it, trust me. Back then they were accepting anybody. And they accepted me even though I still had no plan for my life. I was in a PhD program, a program that was going to grant me my doctorate in the field of experimental psychology, even though I didn't really know what an experimental psychologist did or what the point of this education was. I just knew I wasn't ready to get a job and go out into the real world, right? I wanted to go to graduate school because school is better than work. So, then I got into this program, and realized that the work was essentially horrible as well. It was horrible. And I won't give you the gory details, but we were doing behavioral neuroscience research on rats, administering drugs, seeing long-term effects on the brain and development, and it just wasn't for me. As an animal lover, it just didn't sit right with me. But I decided, am I gonna quit like 40% of my peers in graduate school had done, and in most graduate schools do? 40%, 30 to 40% of people who get into a graduate school don't make it through. Or am I just gonna finish this out, right? Am I gonna stick with it? Am I gonna commit to this and get my PhD and then go where I want to from there? So it was only when I was 25 years old that I said, what do I want to do after I get my PhD? What do I want to do with the rest of my life? I finally figured it out, and I guess you could say the rest is history. So I wrote to a guy at Harvard Medical School. What used to be Mass Mental Health Center is now torn down. You can see it's in various stages of destruction right there. And I wrote to this guy, world leader in the field of genetic epidemiology. Epidemiology is the study of the distribution and determinants of disease in the population. Why do people get sick? Okay, how does that concentrate in certain segments of the population or within families? And I wrote to this guy and I laid it all out. I'm not the best trained, but I will work hard. I know this is what I want to do. And he never wrote back to me. So I waited 6 months. I wrote to him again and I said, you never wrote back to me, but I still want to do this. Use a little guilt. Okay, you better write back to me this time. You didn't write back to me last time. And it worked. He wrote back to me, and the rest of that is history. Then I went to San Diego for 3 years, UCSD down here in the middle. And this was where I first had an encounter, a personal encounter with the symptoms of mental illness. I was doing great in San Diego. I didn't even own a car in San Diego. I didn't have to. All I had was my motorcycle. Never missed a day of work. It's just beautiful weather there. But I was on my motorcycle one time, and people drive fast on the highways in San Diego. Like here, if you go over 80, you're getting a ticket from a trooper. In San Diego, if you're not going 85, you better be in the right lane. So I was riding on and I had a panic attack. And I had done this ride many, many times. But there were some stressful situations in my life at that time, and I had a panic attack while I was on a motorcycle going probably 85 miles an hour. And I pulled over, and I said, what is going on? What is different now as opposed to yesterday? And I couldn't exactly wrap my head around it. And I tried the same route again and again, and probably 50% of the time I would have a panic attack. And I learned how to cope with it. I learned how to manage the symptoms. I don't know if I would have met criteria for a psychiatric disorder, i.e. panic disorder at that time, but I struggled with those symptoms for probably many, many months to a year. And eventually it just went away. Not all people with symptoms of a mental illness or a diagnosable mental illness are that lucky. In fact, most people are not. Most people who get diagnosed with a mental illness will struggle with that for their entire lives, okay? That's the difference, that's a big difference between a lot of the disorders you hear about or you see amongst your family and friends that are very out in the open, like a heart attack or like diabetes. They're chronic conditions that are well managed. The problem with psychiatric disorders, and I'll tell you why it's a problem, is we don't have great treatments for these disorders compared to other medical illnesses because we don't understand where they come from. And where they come from is our brain. And our brain is the most complex machine that's ever been created, okay? So the heart has billions of cardiac cells and certain vasculature and so on. It's well understood, okay? It's complex, but it is well understood. And it's relatively homogeneous compared to the brain, which is made up of billions of neurons of different types and so on. So when we're talking about mental illness and its locus, it's seated in various parts of the most complex machine, and that's why we don't know exactly where yet. It's hard to study the brain in living human patients who have a mental illness. So we don't have good access. We have MRIs that can image what parts of the brain are active or inactive, but that doesn't tell us molecular level, at the cellular level, what's wrong with these neurons? Why are they firing that way? So it's harder to study that than it is the heart or the kidney, okay? So we face all these problems, plus the fact that there's this huge stigma about mental illness. And that's one of the main points that I wanted to talk to you guys about today, is that stigma that gets in the way of people getting the help that they need, coming to us for even research studies for us to learn about people with mental illness, rather than say, I'm sick, I need help, I want to participate in research so you can learn what's going on with me and other people like me. They bury it. They hide it because they're ashamed, because they feel judged, because they are fearful for the practical consequences for their job, for their family, for their friends, okay? That's our problem. That's our fault as a society, not theirs, okay? Not mine, not anyone with a mental illness. That's our problem as a society. You guys, you young people, have the capability to change that, okay? You guys as citizens of the world, as the future leaders of the world, have it in your grasp to make a decision about, am I going to just adhere to the status quo? Am I going to let mental illness be something that people are mocked for, that they're shamed for? Or am I going to educate my parents, my friends, people who say ignorant things about mental illness? Am I going to stop and take the time to teach somebody what's right about mental illness, what we know about mental illness, so they understand it better, so they're more humane? My goal in educating, usually kids a lot younger than you guys, is kids have that capacity still to learn new stuff. When I talk to adults about mental illness, what causes it, why it shouldn't be stigmatized, it's kind of difficult. It's like teaching an old dog new tricks. You've heard that saying. It's difficult. Kids understand, kids learn, okay? And I hope you guys are more aware of these things at your age than I was at my age, and certainly my parents' age. So now I'm at SUNY Upstate Medical University, which is right down the hill from SU. I do research on 3 levels. We study human families who come into our lab and they participate in these experimental psychology trials that we do. We're looking at the way genes, because I'm a genetic epidemiologist, we look at the way that genes influence the way people's brains work when they're playing computer games that they don't really know are illuminating the reward processes in their brain. Okay, so your t-shirts, your Neuroscience Club t-shirts, speak about dopamine as the neurochemical responsible for happiness or reward, right? So we actually study the dopamine system in an indirect way by testing kids and their siblings and their parents and seeing how genes relate to how much reward processing is going on in this family. Does the family work hard for rewards, or do they really not care about small rewards? Does it take a bigger reward to get this family to work than this other family? Does this family learn the rules to earn rewards quicker than this other family? For example, we'll give families a deck of cards. Some of the cards are loaded to give them big rewards. Some of the cards are loaded to take rewards away from them. And we'll ask them to pick randomly and figure out which deck is a profitable deck. Some kids learn this right away. They pick from all 4 decks. They find one that works. They keep picking it until it loses. Then they try other ones, but then they go back to the one that's a winner. Some kids don't learn those rewards. They're not keyed in by the rewarding aspect. It doesn't make a concrete memory for them that they learn right away. And that stuff runs in families, okay? And there's a lot of things about who we are and how our brains work that do run in families. And the reasons they run in families are twofold. First of all, genetics, okay? You've inherited things from your parents like your eye color and maybe your hair color, but you've also inherited genes that wire your brain a certain way. That's part of it. But we also learn from our families, right? Every kid is born with the capacity to speak any language, but most kids speak the same language as their parents. That doesn't mean they've inherited the genes for speaking English, okay? So you can pick up things from your parents, from their genes, but also from what you learn from them, okay? So we study that in the lab. We also do experiments with cells. When we find genes that relate to these interesting psychological constructs, we want to find out how those genes change our brains. So we do those experiments in neurons in a dish. And then we do a third aspect we call dry lab, which is computer science, basically. And it's called dry lab because it better stay dry or we're toast. Spill a soda on that, forget it. So dry lab is number crunching. This will be a bigger and bigger part of your job no matter what you do, whether you're in business, finance, CGI, arts. Numbers, data are everywhere around us. Marketing, this is what people in marketing and finance do, is crunch numbers, okay? So it's not just for science geeks in the lab, but this is a large part of what we do because we're generating so much data and there's not enough people who know how to make biological sense out of that data. That's what I train students to do, is make sense out of all this data, okay? So that's my lab in a nutshell. The lab's called the Psychiatric Genetic Epidemiology and Neurobiology Lab. Marissa's been a member of the lab for a year now, and the vision that I have for the lab is a large vision. Actually, I built this vision out when I was flying from San Diego to Syracuse on a visit when they were trying to recruit me at Upstate. I thought, if I come here, if I start this lab, what is it that I want to accomplish? Up to that point, I probably had no vision. I was just hopping from opportunity to opportunity, which is a good way to grow. But that's not you setting the agenda for your life. That's you responding to other people's agendas. For the first time, I said, what's my agenda? Okay? Now I'm 41. I have this agenda for the rest of my life. No matter however long that is, this is my agenda. We're going to discover the determinants of mental health and mental illness and develop interventions founded on those discoveries. Not just what causes mental illness, what allows people to be resilient, sorry to use the word. What allows people who have so much risk, so much unfavorable circumstance or genetics that they've inherited that puts them at risk for a mental illness, how do they overcome that? What else do they have? Is there a biological basis for resilience? Is it psychological? If it's psychological, where is that encoded in the brain? How can we foster that? Okay? It's not about just knowing what puts people at risk and how we can do away with that. It's knowing what is special about people who are at risk but don't develop an illness. Those are the real superheroes, I think, that we need to study. So my lab is one of the few that studies resilient people who are loaded up with risk factors and they never get sick. What's so special about them? We're interested in these people a lot. And then it's not just academic. You know, they call academia, university life, the ivory tower. And that's not a very favorable connotation, if you were wondering. It means I'm some professor up in a tower, and what I do doesn't impact the real world at all. That's not the type of professor I aspire to be. Part of my vision is that we're going to discover stuff, but we're also going to do something with it and about it. Okay, so I want to show you what my brain looks like. This is my work brain. Okay, so at the heart, if I put the vision into kind of a scheme, at the heart of it is prevention. Okay, I talk with one of my first PhD students, a good friend of mine actually. We trained together and then he did his PhD with me. He was all about cure, find a cure, find a cure. The problem with mental disorders, I think, this is my personal opinion, is we will never find cures for mental disorders. We will find treatments that reduce the symptoms, but mental disorders arrive from the certain wiring of a brain very early in development that puts you at risk. And you can't undo the wiring of the brain. You can modulate neurochemicals by using, you know, the modern mainstream drugs that you see advertised on television to ask your doctor about if you feel depressed, anxious, etc. Those things work only at the level of changing your neurotransmitter levels, the chemicals in your brain. They don't change your neurons, okay? And I don't think we're ever going to be there. But what I think is more likely is if we understand who's at risk from a very, very early age, and then we understand why they are at risk, what are those genes doing to that young brain to make it so that it's not optimal to be healthy, but that it's at risk for mental disorder, then maybe we can intervene at that stage and change that person's trajectory. And we know this works already, and we know how important it is to intervene early. And I see some of you guys nodding off, and I know I'm boring some of you. I'm going to wrap up soon, I promise. But this is the vision. This is what we need to do, is not wait till somebody's affected before we act. We have to know who's at risk and give them an opportunity to avert that risk. It's like, what's the greatest risk factor for lung cancer? It's smoking, right? Can we cure stage 4 lung cancer? No, we cannot. Can we prevent people from starting to smoke? Yes, we can. That's where we'll get with mental illness too. So one last tangent, and this relates to perspectives about prevention, is we're trying to find risk factors. We're trying to find biomarkers. This is like a laboratory test equivalent of a biopsy for cancer. We don't have this in psychiatry. What we have in psychiatry is you feel sick, something's wrong, you go to a doctor checks some boxes about what your symptoms are. If you check enough of those boxes, you're diagnosed with a mental illness. The boxes consist of, do you feel like you're driven by a motor? Do you often skip place in line? These are criteria, diagnostic criteria for ADHD. There's nothing in the diagnostic criteria, what a doctor uses to say you have ADHD or not, that is biological. Yet we know it's a biologically based brain disorder. That's what we're working on, is biological criteria for these disorders. And then mechanisms means, how do these things put your brain at risk, okay? But another avenue for prevention is really early intervention, the earliest possible intervention, okay? What gets in the way of intervention? What gets in the way of people who are starting to show symptoms, are not yet sick with a disorder, from getting the help that they need? It's recognition, okay? It's recognition of the symptoms in yourself or in others. There is a real paucity of education about what mental health looks like and what mental illness looks like in our schools. And this is one of the things that I've been trying to do as a member of NAMI, which is the National Alliance on Mental Illness. We have a Syracuse chapter, is taking this educational program called Breaking the Silence to fourth graders, fifth up through high school, and teaching kids what mental health looks like, what to do when you see signs of mental illness in yourself or others, who to turn to for more information or for help. And also teaching everybody else who's not affected with those symptoms how to embrace that and not stigmatize it. Okay, stigma is like, the word translates from like a dishonor, actually, right? It's like the yellow star that they used to put on the Jews in concentration camps. That's a stigmatizing thing. In our culture, having a mental illness is that same level of stigma. Once you're branded with a mental illness, it affects people's perception of you, it affects their expectations of you, right? And your expectations of yourself then suffer, right? We need to change that by understanding that these are biologically based brain disorders. People don't choose to be mentally ill. There are treatments that kids and adults can get. They're not perfect. And that's why people lose faith in psychiatry, okay? There's not an anti-oncology movement in our country. There's not an anti-cardiology movement in our country. There is an anti-psychiatry movement in our country. People don't trust psychiatrists. I work with a lot of psychiatrists who I trust with my own care, with my own kids' care, because I know the science. But the problem is, the person who's mentally ill is not walking around with a chest tube in or with a cast on their arm. Their symptoms are hidden, right? 1 out of every 4 people in this room will have the signs or symptoms of a mental illness, if not be diagnosed with a mental illness in their lifetime. 1 in 4. Now, who in here has been affected by a mental illness? Raise your hand. That's not quite 1 in 4, okay? Now, you might have taken my question to mean, which of you feels like you've had the symptoms of a mental illness, okay? But that's not what I'm talking about. When I say affected by it, that means someone you know, someone you love. More hands are going up. A family member, a friend, okay? So let's see those hands now. Who's been affected by mental illness, okay? Pretty much everybody, right? And those of you who aren't raising your hand, you're either very, very lucky, or you don't know the people in your life as well as you think you do. Because people hide their mental illness. And the reason they do that is because they're afraid that they're going to be rejected from a job, from a friendship, from an invitation to a party or a wedding, because of their symptoms of their mental illness, okay? That's the absolute worst way to treat someone with a mental illness. The only way a person with a mental illness will get better is through supportive social supports, through therapy, psychotherapy, possibly medication, okay? Isolation is the absolute worst, because if they feel like there's no safe place for them to go to get help, they'll go untreated for longer. And the science says the sooner you intervene when someone has symptoms of mental illness, the more likely they are to recover, okay? So again, I know it's late. I thank you guys for hanging in there. What we need to do, what I want to appeal to you guys to do, is if you see someone changing their behavior, they're becoming more withdrawn, they're not their usual selves, they seem to not feel joy in the things that they used to take joy in, they're not participating in their activities. If that describes you, go to an adult, okay? Tell somebody. Doesn't mean you're going to be branded for life. It doesn't mean you have to suffer alone, okay? We're trying to build a culture in the next generation that's much more empathic than the generation I grew up with and my parents' generation, okay? The choice is up to you guys. Thank you.